Welcome back to economics. We are talking about the functions of the Federal Reserve System. We've got one more that we're going to cover today. Unfortunately for you guys, it's the most complicated, longest, and mathematical one of all. Well, maybe that last part wasn't bad for you, but it's bad for me. So let's get started into it. Letter F, creating money. The Fed has developed several powerful methods to expanding and contracting the money supply. So number one, let's talk about it. The money multiplier effect. Thing you need to know about the money multiplier effect is it is the expansion of the money supply as a result of commercial banks lending their depositors money to others. We've talked about this in times past. You put in money into the bank, the money doesn't just stay in the bank, they then loan that money out to other people. Your $100 just became $200, or, well, thanks to fractional reserve, your $100 just became $190, and so that's how it works. On page 218 in your textbooks, I'm going to be reading the last paragraph on to page 219. So if you want to follow along, I think it'll be helpful for you as I do so. The money multiplier effect is the expansion of the money supply as a result of commercial banks lending their depositors money to others, as we just defined. Let us look at an example of how it works. Suppose Mrs. Jones deposits $10,000 cash into her checking account at First National Bank. Assuming the Fed requires banks to hold reserves equaling 10% of their deposits, First National must keep at least $1,000 either in its vault or on deposit with its Federal Reserve District Bank. The bank may now lend the remaining $9,000 in excess reserves. Later that day, Mr. Smith walks into First National Bank and requests a $9,000 auto loan. How convenient. The bank grants the loan, and he takes the check to Honest John's Auto Sales and purchases a car. John deposits the $9,000 check into his checking account at Second National Bank. To meet its reserve requirements, Second National holds 10%, or $900, of the $9,000 as reserves and then lends out the excess $8,100 to another borrower, who in turn deposits a check to his account in Third National Bank. On and on the process continues. If all the participating banks lent out all the deposits in excess of their required reserves, and if all the recipients of those loans redeposited the entire amounts, Mrs. Jones' original $10,000 would multiply into $100,000 worth of new deposits. The reason for this phenomenon is simple. If Mrs. Jones had personally lent Mr. Smith $9,000, she would have relinquished ownership of the money. However, when her bank lent the money, Mrs. Jones still retained ownership of the $10,000 in her account, while Mr. Smith gained ownership of $9,000. To determine how much the money supply may grow, you could add up all the new deposits as depicted in figure 11.3 below, or you could use a simple formula. Let's use the formula now. The formula is D times 1 divided by RR. So that X, that's a multiplication symbol, so don't think of it, as a math letter number. It's D times 1 divided by RR. D stands for the initial deposit. As again, we're just continuing down the page if you're following along. D equals the initial deposit. And then RR stands for the reserve requirement. Got that? So let's give you one more definition or one more term that we're going to identify, and then I'll give you some examples that you'll want to create. Because in case you're asked this on a test, you'll also want to recreate similar illustrations. The money multiplier, thing you need to know about that is it's factored as 1 divided by RR. It represents the expansion of money supply as a result of commercial banks lending their depositors money to others. That's what money multiplier is. So let's give you an illustration. I'm going to give you a moment. You can always pause the video, of course, if you need more time to answer it. But let's give you an illustration. Let's say that the initial deposit was $1 million. I know, it's a nice round number for you. $1 million. And that the reserve requirement was 10%. How would you find the answer? How would you figure out what the total extra money could be? Well, you could either use figure 11.3 and do it the long way, or you can use the formula. So what's the answer? The answer is $10 million. It grew by a factor of 10. In case any of you got that question wrong, 1 million times 1 divided by, and this is where you might have messed up, 0.10. You shouldn't have said 10. That would have messed up your whole equation. 1 million times 1 divided by 0.1, because 10% is 0.1 of 1. And that equals $10 million. If you don't believe me, use your calculator. Let me give you one more example. Let's say that the initial deposit is $2,000 and the reserve requirement is 8%. All right, you would have 2,000 times 1 divided by 0.08, because again, 8%, and that would equal $25,000. Question though for you. Do you think that when people money, seeing the illustration that we just saw, when someone puts in money and then the bank loans that money out and then another person puts in money and that person loans it out, do you think that we will always meet the maximum quantity? $1 million at 10% becomes $10 million. Do you think we'll actually get to that 10 million? Or 2,000 at 8%, will we get that extra $25,000? The answer is no. It'll actually be left unfulfilled. We will not get the full potential money multiplier effect for 2 reasons. Letter A, one reason is banks rarely lend out all that they can. Just because they can lend out 90% of the money doesn't mean they're going to. Historically, banks have tended to hold slightly more of their depositors' money on reserve than the Fed requires. And second of all, letter B, not all recipients of loans will redeposit the entire loan. You put in your $100, Susie takes out a $90 loan and she gives it, so that she can buy whatever. That person doesn't necessarily put in the $90 into another bank. Maybe they keep that money and put it in their wallet. Maybe they only put $50 into the bank. So you can see not all recipients of loans will redeposit the entire loan. Whether they like holding on to cash, like I do, or they distrust banks, like some people do, some people will choose to hold their money in the form of currency as opposed to depositing it into their checking accounts. Such decisions short-circuit the money multiplier, for money that is not redeposited cannot be re-lent. For example, given that the average reserve requirement in the U.S. today is about 6%, the multiplier should be about 16 times 1 divided by 0.0 to get that, the original deposit. Yet, because people choose to hold currency, and because banks do not lend all that they could, the real multiplier is approximately 2.9 times the initial deposit, much smaller than the potential amount. There'll be more information about the money multiplier effect at the end of this lesson real quickly. But let's continue. Number 2. The tools of money creation. To change the quantity of money in the nation's money supply, the Fed may either change the amount of money subject to the multiplier effect, or they may change the multiplier. This can be done in 3 different ways. Letter A, they can change the discount rate. The term discounting, by the way, means the Fed lending money to banks. I'm reading page 220, part of the 3rd paragraph. It says, when a bank borrows money from the Fed, there is no need to print new money to write or clear checks or for any gold or silver to change hands. The Federal Reserve simply creates the money by informing the bank that it has credited the funds to the bank's reserve account. With the extra money, the bank may now make additional loans that cause the money supply to grow via the multiplier. So, discounting, the Fed lending money to banks. A discount rate, definition for you is, it is the interest rate the Fed charges on the loans it grants to banks. Just as a bank attracts more borrowers by charging a lower interest rate, the Fed attracts more borrowers by charging a lower interest rate. By raising the discount rate, the Fed could also discourage borrowing and cut the growth of the money supply. We'll go into more details about that later. While this means can be used to change the money supply, it is usually done simply to assist banks that find themselves temporarily unable to meet large demands for withdrawals. Letter B, another way that money can be created is by changing the reserve requirement. You saw earlier that if the reserve requirement is 10%, it could potentially multiply new deposits by a factor of 10. 1 divided by 0.1 equals 10. If the Fed wanted to increase the money supply, it could simply lower the reserve requirement, which would have the effect of increasing the money multiplier. For example, if the reserve requirement were lowered to 5%, the money multiplier would rise to 20. 1 divided by 0.05 equals 20. Similarly, it could decrease the money supply by raising the reserve requirement. Because small changes in the reserve requirement can cause dramatic changes in the money supply, the Fed has been hesitant to use this method to adjust the money supply, except in the direst economic circumstances. And then letter C, the last way that they can create money is using open market operations. Using open market operations. This means, and this is worth noting, this is used most frequently. It's an action whereby the Fed purchases or sells governmental securities in the open market to inject money into or withdraw money from the economy. If the Federal Reserve wishes to increase the nation's money supply, it simply purchases bonds in the open market, placing into the banking system new funds that flow into circulation. If, on the other hand, the Fed wishes to decrease the money supply, it sells bonds, thereby pulling money into itself and away from the general population. Suppose that the Federal Open Market Committee, well, actually, I don't have time for that. Just read. Sorry, guys. Turn your books to page 221. I want you to read the last paragraph to yourself so that you can understand what I was going to read to you guys, but you can handle it yourself. Another thing that is worth noting, once you have finished reading, please unpause the video and we'll continue. Welcome back. One thing that is worth noting under this is that the Fed may write checks on funds it creates by merely adjusting its books. After all, it controls all the banks. The Fed's actions in creating money can be economically dangerous and are counter to the classic liberal capitalistic free market economy. So if you look at page 221, the chart, it shows the Fed's monetary policy tools. It shows you the 3 methods it does it. It shows you the actions that are caused, the effects, and then the impact on the economy. If you had questions or you wanted to make sure you understand the material that we talked about today, especially concerning the money multiplier effect, I recommend looking in your activities book to page 123 to 125 and doing some of the questions that are on there. If you have any questions about it, you can ask me. Otherwise, no homework assigned tonight. Be good, do good. Bye.